Good morning. I'm up bright and early and I'm going to be talking a little bit about tents today. 5:30 and I'm still a little bit late for the sunrise. I don't know if it's the algorithm, but I got a few messages yesterday asking about more budget-friendly tents. So I thought I'd talk about tents under £200, talk about the things that I look for in a tent, and come up with a few suggestions and examples. So if you want to start camping, it's not essential that you spend hundreds of pounds on a tent. Take Glastonbury Festival that happened last week. There'll have been thousands of people spending 3 nights in £20 pop-up tents, and they were perfectly fine. That kind of tent's fine if you're just pitching up in a field for a couple of days, but if you want to go camping in the hills and mountains, you're going to need something a bit more robust. So you really need to have a think about what you're going to be using your tent for, how often you're going to use it. You're going to be using it in colder weather or windy conditions. So all tents are different and you've got to know what the limitations are. I need to get my steps in. So the tents I'm going to be talking about today go up to a budget of around £200. Me personally, I wouldn't want to be putting my trust in a £15 tent from Tesco's if I'm camping up on Kinder Scout. I'm not saying in good weather conditions you couldn't get away with it, but I have seen quite a few of these cheaper tents with fiberglass poles abandoned and trashed in places and conditions where they're just not up to the job. At the very least, I recommend that you get a tent that's either got aluminium poles or utilises your trekking poles that you're taking anyway for walking with, which brings me on nicely to the different styles of tents. So you've got your traditional style tent, which comes with poles, fly sheet, inner sleeping area, things like that. Then you've got trekking pole tents, which comes with the fly sheet and maybe the inner, and you have to utilise your poles to actually make the tent stand up. So some of the tents that come with poles, they're freestanding, which means that once you've got the structure up, you can actually move the tent around, and if there was no wind at all, the tent would have its structure. Whereas with some pole tents and trekking pole tents, you actually need to peg the fly sheet out to keep the tent standing up. Welcome to the jungle. And there's a couple more things to consider. Do you want a 3-season tent or a 4-season tent? So a 3-season tent usually has lots of ventilation and mesh around the inner, which is great for the warmer months or maybe from spring to autumn. And a 4-season tent will have more of a solid inner, a bit less ventilation. The fly sheet will probably come down right to the ground, which will keep you warmer in the colder months, but when summer comes around, it might be a little bit stuffy in the tent and you might not get the ventilation that you really want. And then you might want to think about the size of the tent. So usually a 2-person tent means a 1-person tent with their gear. A 3-person tent is a 2-person tent with gear. Make sure to check the dimensions of the tent that you're looking at, just to make sure that it's long enough for you, it's got enough headroom for you, and make sure that it's wide enough to fit your sleeping pads in. Right, with all that out of the way, let's start talking about a few actual tent examples. So all these tents that I'm going to talk about, I have actually used in a wild camping situation. I'm not going to say that one is better than the other. You just have to be wary of what the limitations of each of these tents are. All of them are waterproof and will keep you dry. Usually the biggest problem you're going to come up against is wind. So I may as well start with the tent that I got out of the bag earlier. That is the 3F UL gear Tie G2. That one you can pick up for around £155 at the moment. It weighs 1.8 kilos and it's a freestanding tent. You can get it in either a 3-season or a 4-season format. However, from my experience, it is not a 4-season tent. It won't hold up to the worst conditions. I've used that in the mountains of Wales and was perfectly fine, but there wasn't a lot of wind. Whereas when the wind came around in the Lake District, it flattened the tent. But there's plenty of space inside, and if you're not going to be pitching it in windy conditions, then it's not a bad option. So if you're like me and use trekking poles when you go hiking, then the Lanshan tents are a great option. These come in a few different formats. The Lanshan 1, which is a 1-person tent and only uses 1 trekking pole. And then you've got the Lanchan 2, which is obviously the 2-person version. And you will need 2 trekking poles for that, but you're getting the extra space. So the Lanchan 1 is around 140 pounds and it weighs in at 800 grams. But the Lanchan 2 Pro is around 180 pounds. It's only 100 grams more at 900 grams. And you're getting twice the space inside. However, it is a single skin tent, which means it doesn't have an inner built into it. These are only really 3-season tents and they can stand a moderate amount of wind, but I won't be going out in them in 30 miles an hour plus. By the way, the Lanchan is more of a style of tent. There's lots of different manufacturers of this, from 3FUL Gear, there is Flames Creed, and a few others as well. So if you're on a budget, Nature Hike make a few decent tents as well. So there is the Cloud Peak 2, which is a little bit on the bulky side. I think it weighs around 2.4 kilos. And you can get it around 160 pounds. That's got a decent amount of room inside as well. It is a fully freestanding tent. It looks pretty good. It's a copy of a Hilleberg Alac, I think. It's a pretty decent tent actually. I've used that tent in winds up to around 30 miles an hour. And to be honest with you, I wouldn't recommend taking any of the more budget tents out in windy conditions. So I've also used the Vic 1 from Nature Hike, which is also a pretty decent tent. That only weighs in at 1.1 kilos, I think it is. But that's also a single skin tent, which you do need to be careful with. If there is any condensation, you could be directly touching that with your sleeping bag, etc. You can pick up a few decent tents from Go Outdoors as well. So the Fox 2, which is, it's around 75 pounds at the moment. It's a little bit heavier and bulkier at 2.1 kilos, and it doesn't have a lot of headroom, but it's a very solid tent. You have to be careful when you buy it, Go Outdoors, because one minute they're 75 pounds, next day they might be 150 pounds. So don't pay full price for one of them. Wait till they're on offer. And then there's the famous OEX Bobcat. I think I paid 59 pounds for mine, and it's 110 at the moment. I think that, yeah, it's only 1.9 kilos. It's quite a robust tent. You have a look at some of the videos on YouTube, not mine, but where they're going toe to toe with more expensive Hillebergs and things like that. The Bobcat's only a single pole tent and there's not a lot of room inside, so if you're on the taller side or bulky or you like to spread out, you might want to look at something else. So OEX also do the ultralight version of the Bobcat, 950 grams. It's not as robust as the heavier version and there's no more room inside, but it's a reasonable option if you want something that's more ultralight. My first backpacking style tent was a Vango Banshee 300. I never used it wild camping, but I did take it on campsites. But the Banshee 200 was the go-to tent for wild campers when I started out. You can get it for around 145 pounds, 2.4 kilos. It is pretty robust, and out of all the tents that I've mentioned today, it's one of the better ones in the wind. You can get them for around 145 pounds at the moment, which I don't think is too bad at all. There's also the Vango Nevis 2, which is 2 kilos. That's only 99 pounds. And I've used that in some pretty rough conditions actually. Winter in the Brecon Beacons. Tent I used for my first proper wild camp. So that's pretty much it for my list, but there are other brands to check out. I know a lot of people swear by the Decathlon tents. I've used a couple of One Tigers tents, which are pretty good as well. A little bit bulkier and bigger those ones were though. Try not to overthink it, because all of these tents around that budget are pretty much of a muchness. The materials are similar. They'll stand up to the same sort of conditions. The toughest part is probably working out which style of tent is best for you, whether you need to have something that's freestanding. Don't buy a trekking pole tent if you don't really use trekking poles. It's just a waste of time in my opinion. And back to where I started. Story of my life. I know it sounds a bit hypocritical coming from somebody that uses very expensive tents, but in the reality is you don't need to spend 600, 700, 800 pounds on a tent to enjoy camping or wild camping. I've personally used many different budget tents. You just have to realise the limitations of the manufacturing and material. So choose a little bit nicer weather. Firstly, it's more enjoyable to camp in nicer weather. And secondly, your tent's going to survive the night. Anyway, enough rambling. I'll see you tomorrow.